So let's not waste any more time. I am thrilled to introduce Voltaire, as I said, co-founder and CEO of mStoner. He began his career in education as a development officer and spent roughly a decade as a fundraiser and alumni relations officer before completing his MBA and starting the firm with Rob and Michael. During today's session, you can tweet Voltaire at @VSantosMoran. You can tweet me at Mallory Wood. And don't forget to use that hashtag mStonerNow. Voltaire, I've talked way too much. It is all you. I'm going to turn off my webcam. Let's get this session started.
Sounds great, Mallory. Thanks very much, and thank you to everyone who's taken the time to attend this webinar today. Grateful for all of you, and I realize how important your time is. So I will commit that we will wrap up the webinar by 2:45 Eastern Time. Which is what I believe we said we would use of your time today. But I'll be around anytime after that, and we'll keep the webinar open as long as anyone has any questions or wants to talk about anything that they've seen in the presentation. So a quick shout out to a number of current and former clients who I know who are on the call. So Greg and Todd and Maggie and Amy and Alex and Tim and Francisco, thanks for joining us as well. All right, let's get started. So experience map. There we go. That's me. As Mallory mentioned, I got my start in development roughly about 20-some years ago, and my background before then was really communications and psychology. And so the things that I have learned about using experience maps have really been really helpful for tying those disciplines together, and I'm hoping that you will find these things helpful as well. So the slide deck is now available on SlideShare, and we will make this presentation available to you shortly, but feel free to go to SlideShare if you'd like and search mStoner CEO, and you will find the PDF available there. And then as a reminder, Mallory mentioned that we're using the hashtag mStonerNow. We will be asking you to tweet out comments and questions throughout the presentation. Mallory will be watching them, and then we'll pass them on to me. All right, so first question, if you wouldn't mind tweeting out, what interests you about experience maps? So what I want to cover during the time we have together are 5 basic things. The principles of experience mapping, examples of experience maps. I'll show you 4 different examples of what we think are really nice models. Wants to cover 6 things to do before you draw. Some tools for creating those experience maps, and when it is that those experience maps are going to be the most helpful for you. So to start, let's talk a little bit about principles of experience mapping. What is an experience map, you might ask? An experience map is basically a visual diagram, and it illuminates the holistic customer experience, demonstrating the highs and lows people feel while interacting with your product or service. Adaptive Path actually pioneered, I would say, the development of experience maps, and honestly, I'm a huge fanboy of Adaptive Path. Have had the opportunity to work with one of their founders, Indy Young, who also authored mental models, and a little bit later today, I'll show you how some research projects we've done with Indy have actually informed the development of experience maps. So what I love about experience maps, or one of the many things I love, is that these things become shorthand for everything that you have learned or everything that you have heard from people, all of the research that you've done, all the data that you've collected. And what experience maps do is they illustrate that information in a way that is a lot more telegraphic than a 50-page report or even a series of diagrams. So I think that you'll find experience maps are incredibly helpful in terms of making connections with stakeholders across the institution, rallying people around the sort of experience you want your audiences to have, and also, frankly, for driving positive change. So a couple of actually comments. Experience maps are really flexible in that they can be incredibly granular. They can outline, for instance, the process of buying a cup of coffee. Or they can be fairly large. They could outline, for instance, the example of applying for undergraduate or graduate admissions. So some ideas of things that people might want to use experience maps for: that application process, perhaps the campus tour, the process of registering for the first time for classes, maybe the sort of experience that someone goes through making their first gift online, or deciding whether to register for an event, Or if you are a parent, for instance, orientation during the first week of your child's classes. So I think that experience maps are fairly flexible in the different types of processes and experiences that they can help illustrate. Now, I want to draw a brief distinction between experience maps, which are basically the artifact, that it's the diagram that you have, and the process of experience mapping. And experience mapping includes several things. It includes conducting interviews and research, drafting the map itself, revising the map, and then using the map as a reference. And I find that experience maps are really helpful for a number of different situations. Let's say, for instance, you happen to be in an organization. I know this really doesn't happen within higher ed, but let's say you happen to be in an organization where there are multiple units that are involved in delivering a service or a process, and no one talks to each other. Or maybe you are in an organization that is going through some sort of transition or change. Or maybe you know that something is broken in the process, but you're not really quite sure what it is or how to fix it. And a last example of where this is helpful is maybe you've collected a lot of data. Maybe you've done qualitative surveys and quantitative surveys. You've done a lot of focus groups, and you've got this massive information, and you want to make it useful outside of your office and communicate what you've learned to a broad base of constituents or stakeholders. Experience maps are really helpful for that. So 3 things I'd like you to keep in mind when experience mapping. First is purpose, people, and process. So in terms of purpose, experience maps should visualize the customer experience with a product across locations, times, and channels. And I think that'll become a little bit clearer as I show you some examples. The main thing to remember about this is the focus is your customer or your audience. It's not your service or your product. This really is and has its basis in user-centered design. For a web project specifically, an experience map can be a powerful tool for relating web content to different parts of the journey. And honestly, and I'll show you this with one experience map we created for graduate admissions, for identifying areas that are really not about being online, but really about the human experience, the high-touch, high-value experience you have with people through that process. The second thing to keep in mind is it's about people. The experience map exercise, mapping, should really lead you to a better understanding of and empathy with your audiences. Experience mapping can draw stakeholders together and give them a common point of reference. Again, with higher ed, a lot of times we end up working in silos and everyone is trying to do the best job possible, but communicating across those silos is sometimes really hard, and coming to a shared set of values or a common experience that we want our audiences to have is something that's hard to come by. So experience mapping is a process that can really help draw people together and give them a rallying point for what it is that you want your experience or your process or your product to be like. And then finally, process. Experience maps are a means for producing better and more effective interactions. And to quote Chris Risen, Design Director at Adaptive Path, a good experience map feels like a catalyst, not a conclusion. So in many ways, what you end up illustrating should start to generate ideas for how you can improve the process, how you can fill in gaps, and how you can improve the experience across the board. So let's take a quick pause for another tweet out, if you wouldn't mind. If you have created an experience map before, what did you map? Okay, so now let's get to a couple of examples of experience maps. I want to show you 4 of very different things. The first one comes from Adaptive Path, and this particular experience map outlines the journey that someone has when they're booking rail travel in Europe. So Rail Europe, the company that they work for, is basically a company that provides an online booking system that unifies railway travel throughout Europe so that you can go through major cities as easily as possible. And this experience map shows the customer journey from the point that they start looking at their options and finding out what's possible in terms of rail travel to the post-travel process. So what you'll see here, and we'll walk through the different pieces of this experience map, is a fairly detailed diagram that outlines everything from the guiding principles to the journeys and the thoughts and the feelings and the experiences throughout that journey, and then the opportunities that are identified as a result of all of the research that's been conducted. So let's start with the top, the guiding principles. If you look at the top of this diagram, what you'll see are 4 boxes that really provide the anchor principles for why they decided to map this. So the first is that people choose railway travel because it's convenient, easy, and flexible. Railway travel is also one part of a larger travel process, and they build their plans over time, and that people value services that are efficient and personable. So those guiding principles are really the start of the mapping process. The second part of this map that we'll show is, oh, whoopsie. Hold, please. Okay, there we go. The second part shows the different stages of railway travel planning. So we've got research and planning, shopping, booking, post-booking, travel and pre-travel, and travel itself, and then that last stage. And this outlines the different parts of the user journey. As we go further down into the diagram, what you see is what people do. So you'll see in that first big box in research and planning and shopping that people look at destination pages, they look at timetables, they use live chat for questions, they scour blogs and travel sites, and then they talk with friends. What you'll see in this code is that it's a fairly cyclical sort of process. It isn't a very linear process. In this stage of exploration, people are actually going through these steps a number of different times. And in this particular map, Adaptive Path has actually weighted the size of each of the icons to show how often or how prevalent that behavior is. As you move toward the right, you'll see within booking and post-booking new behaviors like calling if difficulties occur, printing e-tickets home, changing plans, checking ticket statuses, and then you'll see in that final map the travel and the post-travel. As you drill further down into the diagram, what you'll see are the different thought patterns, feelings, and experiences that people have in each of these stages. And then finally, as you take a look at the bottom, this part of the map identifies the opportunities for improvement that Rail Europe outlined as a result of understanding the sort of mental models, the feelings, and the expectations that different audiences had as they were booking their travel. So to recap, this map basically identifies steps from planning through journey to post-travel. It visualizes multiple. I'm going to ask you guys to hold for just a second while I change a setting here so I can actually see this. And whoopsie. Mallory, can you still hear me?
Yep, I'm here. Yep, but just so you know, we don't see your slides at the moment.
Yeah, I had a mere glitch with GoToMeeting, so I'm going to be relaunching it. Hold on just a second.
Oh, of course, no problem. You know, let me share with you some of the conversation that's taking place on the back channel because it's really active. And one of the participants, in response to your last question, Julie said that she mapped how members really use a children's museum, which I think that's really an interesting case for an experience map. And Julie, I tweeted you back, but I would really love to hear more about how that experience went. Voltaire, your little joke about how higher ed, you know, never has had to experience committees or silos, that went over pretty well. People were chuckling in the back channel, which was great. And hey, I see that you're back, so I am going to toss those presenter controls your way so we can keep rolling.
Great, thank you. With great power comes great responsibility.
It's the truth.
All right.
And just so you know, we don't see your webcam, so you just got to flip that on.
Okay, hold on just a second. There we go.
I suppose while you're doing that, this is also a great time to say happy birthday to Tim Neckrich, who's joining us today. So yay, happy birthday, Tim.
Happy birthday, Tim. All right.
And Voltaire, you're back. Onward.
Awesome. Thank you for your patience while I made things happen. All right, so a couple of other points for the recap. This focuses on customers' feelings, thoughts, and actions, and identifies improvement opportunities for improving the experience. Let's take a look at another experience map. This is an experience map for a broadband service provider created by Effective UI. And this was really, unlike the experience map that you saw with Adaptive Path, this begins with a story. So what you see here is the persona of Sarah. Sarah is moving her family of 3. She knows that she's going to need phone and internet service, and she's shopping around for that. So this particular experience map highlights at first Sarah, and then you'll see the phases of the journey from inquiry to comparison to purchase and installation, really at the baseline or the axis of this entire experience map. On top of it, what they have mapped are thoughts and feelings, the emotional experiences, and then if you'll see this sort of, it actually kind of looks like Moby Dick. If you take a look at the darker brown shade, it's the emotional, what they've done is they've mapped emotional high and low experiences here, and they've mapped that across those 4 different points of the process. And then finally, again, they mapped recommendations for improvement based on what the experience has been for the persona. So in this particular experience map, the story begins with a person. It again combines feelings and thoughts, this time into one category with the understanding that they're connected. It identifies service gaps where the potential customer may experience emotional lows. And then finally, it finishes with opportunities for improving the experience. All right. So I mentioned that experience maps can be used for something as granular as buying a cup of coffee. So this is what your experience at Starbucks looks like. I'm sure everyone's going to look at this map and say, oh my God, that is so me, right? So this is the Starbucks experience map, and what you'll see here is that the phases are again in the axis. So the touch points for interaction with a potential Starbucks clients are anticipate, enter, engage, exit, and reflect. Underneath that, they have an incredibly granular set of points within each of those phases. It's a lot of detail, but anyone who has had any interaction with Starbucks realizes that they pay a lot of attention to detail. Everything from the smell of coffee to the art on the walls and the music that someone is exposed to. You'll see at the top the enriched experience, what people at Starbucks are aiming for in terms of what they want their clients to feel and see and hear. And what you'll see underneath is the poached experience. What could go wrong within that experience that would ruin that particular time that a person is going in to buy a cup of coffee? And so to recap, again, each touch point is described in detail. It establishes customers' baseline expectations, improves opportunities for improving the experience, and then identifies places where some customers might have a bad experience. So let me show you one last example, and this is an example of an experience map that we created. And this example shows the prospective graduate-student process. So everything from starting to research programs all the way to making that transition into becoming a graduate student. So you'll see that this is, if you recall the Adaptive Path example, you'll see that this draws heavily on their schematic. So at the top of this are the principles behind which the graduate student experience that we outlined should lie, really. So the first is don't make them think. The process of exploring and applying should be clear and straightforward. We also knew that one of the principles of the application process is that we needed to give people freedom to do various things throughout the process, knowing that this isn't really a linear thing. People bounce back and forth across the different stages throughout the process. The third principle was we wanted to make sure that the brand of the institution was communicated throughout the process and that people experienced the institution as engaging, cosmopolitan, unpretentious, and enthusiastic. And then finally, The last principle was that we wanted our client to think beyond the website. So while this was a website project, we expected, and rightly so, that some of the best opportunities for improvement were not in the online process itself, but in the high-touch interactions that happened between the use of the website. So what you'll see after the principles are stages. Now, these stages were actually drawn from a research project that we had done with Indy Young for University at Buffalo maybe 5, 6 years ago. And I think it's important to note that because when you're working with experience maps, you're not just drawing on those conversations you've had or the research that you've done. Experience maps are a really great time to pull in industry standards that you know about or research that other reliable sources have already conducted. So we took all of the research that we did, all of the interviews that we did for University of Buffalo. We created an incredibly detailed mental model at that time. And then for this particular project, we narrowed all of those mental model spaces and towers, if you're familiar with the nomenclature, into these 4 stages: understanding, narrowing, deciding, and then transitioning. So we outlined in the thinking and the feeling spaces what we knew that prospective students were thinking and feeling as they went through each of these stages. And anyone who has applied to grad school or talked with anyone who has applied to grad school will probably see that these things are fairly familiar. People go through excitement and frustration and anticipation and doubt and relief and mixed feelings throughout the process. And we wanted to capture that because we realized that that really has a great influence on the way that people behave and the choices that they make. In the doing section, we outlined the different activities that we knew prospective students engaged in as they went from understanding and exploring different options all the way to making the transition. And one of the fascinating things about this is if you compare the experience map of an undergraduate applicant to a graduate applicant, you'll find, I think, that they're markedly different. One of the things that I really loved about the learning that took place in this particular process is that we found that if you take a look all the way in the transition area, where, or in the border between deciding and accepting and transition, where someone is deciding if right now is the right time for grad school. That's a behavior that's very specific to graduate students. I don't think that undergrads go through the, well, should I put it off a year or 3 years until I get into the right institution anywhere near as much as a graduate student does. The other learning that I thought was really fascinating in this particular project is that accepting an offer for admissions and making the deposit is incredibly fraught. And one of the things that we found with this client was that there was, for instance, a 3-week gap between the time that a graduate student would get their acceptance letter and the time that they would get their financial aid package. And that 3-week gap was significant because a lot of people applying for grad school are so uncertain and worried about what they're going to do that they tend to jump at the first really good financial offer they get. And so for one client in particular, the biggest learning was we need to close that gap between acceptance and the aid offer, because we lose some incredibly good students who are really competitive in terms of their ability to get aid to institutions that we don't want to lose to. You'll see further on in the map that we mapped out likely destinations. So as people are going from understanding to narrowing and deciding and transitioning, there are likely spaces that they'll be visiting on your website. And we wanted to make sure that those pages in particular were well designed for perspectives. And then finally, what you'll see at the bottom is the opportunities that we see for improving the process, not just on the website itself, but the entire process that a graduate student goes through as they're applying for different programs. So, quick recap. This draws heavily from a railway model from Adaptive Path, uses icons in the doing section to visualize customer actions, and we basically connected phases with likely destinations on the web to help the strategy become more actionable. All right, so quick tweet out, everyone. If you know any other good examples of experience maps, would love to hear about them or read about them on Twitter. And then let's cover the last few things that I wanted to outline for you in this webinar. 6 things to do before you draw. You might be asking, well, what do I need exactly to create an experience map? You need information, you need data. And 6 areas that we think that you can scour to get that information. Start with the stories and the conversations that you already know. So the first thing I would do is remember and review notes from one-on-one conversations that you've had with people from your target audience, or the anecdotes that you've heard from people who work directly with them. That information is incredibly useful in starting to populate an experience map. The second is to review any brand marketing studies or research that your institution has performed with the audience group that you're mapping. So market research often has a shelf life of somewhere between 5 to 10 years, depending on the methodology. And reviewing that information could be really helpful in providing more detail and nuance and insight into how your audiences think. The third thing to do is actually talk to the people who answer the phones and answer and actually the emails. So the people who are on the front lines, the people who are day-to-day answering the phones and giving people instruction, often have a handle on what is the most important information that people are looking for and what hardest stuff is defined. I remember, for instance, with that graduate experience map project that we were doing, I was talking with one of the departmental assistants, and she said to me, you know, one of the biggest things that people ask us about this place is, what's the weather like? And I asked her a little bit more about that, and she said, well, we get a lot of international students applying here for graduate programs who have never seen a winter or who have never been overseas, and so they have no idea what to expect, and they don't find that information on the site. So understanding those little pieces, those questions that people have as, for instance, they're making a transition to graduate school, is really helpful in order to understand what the mindset is and to help them to make that transition a little bit easier. Fourth, I would talk to leadership in different areas. I know for a fact that the point of views of deans and department chairs are much different from leadership in admissions. So talking to those subject matter experts and talking to those leaders and finding out what they know about your audiences, what they know about the experience, and what they would like the experience to be is helpful information. Number 5, review your site and your microsite analytics. Your site analytics and your search logs will also give you insight into what your audiences find valuable and will help you identify weak areas of your website specifically. And then finally, seeing what else is out there. There are lots of sources, I would say, for reliable research. They would include Jared Poole, the Nielsen Norman Group. Rosenfeld Media produces some great books from industry experts that would be helpful for people to look at as well. And I would lean on any external research and usability information that you can use to help create that experience map. All right, another tweet out, please. What other ways might you prepare for experience mapping before starting to draw the map? So if any of you have done this before, would love you to tweet out any tips and things that people should watch out for as they begin this process. Okay, so tools for creating maps. The drawing tools, how we picked these are, number one, we wanted them to be easy to create the experience. The tool has to be affordable, and the tool has to be somewhat widely accepted and vetted in the industry. So I can tell you that for all the experience maps that we create, we actually use Keynote. It is easy to get around, it's free with all Macs, and it allows multiple people to be able to edit that. Other tools that you might consider are PowerPoint, which honestly is just a little bit clunkier, Sketch, which is great, but is only available for Macs, and then finally Illustrator, which is the most expensive and probably requires the most specialized skills, but will also give you, I think, much more capability to make beautiful illustrations of your experience maps. So if anyone uses any other tools, please tweet that out to mStoner now so that you can share that information with other attendees. And then this comes from Doug, one of our strategists, free icons. So if you search for free icons on smashingmagazine.com, you'll find more than 2,000 results. And the sets are important because they contain multiple icons that you can use, and icons are really quite helpful in making those experience maps come to life. And then finally, last thing I wanted to cover with you all in our time is when to reference the map. So there are really 4 stages at which I think the map becomes really helpful. So during strategy, the experience map can inform the information architecture and the content model. Going back to the graduate admissions experience map that we created, what we did with that experience map is we used that experience map to drive the creation of 8 personas for the site, and then we used those personas to actually create the editorial calendar and even to select the types of people that we wanted blogging for graduate admissions. During design, the experience map is a reference for how to enable and empower the customer to complete tasks. During content production, the experience map is a reference for voice and tone, but it also helps you to get a little bit more granular in the planning of content over time. And then finally, during testing, the map can be a reference for making sure that a site delivers a premium experience, or as I had mentioned before, when the site isn't the issue. When it is that you find that a high-touch, high-value interaction is where it is that you can realize the most gain, the map is a reference point to make sure that people understand that that is in fact the case. So I guess this slide is shorthand for the fact that the map should be useful through the entire life cycle of your project and hopefully even beyond the project. I know, for instance, that with the graduate experience map that we did, they're using that to drive changes in the centralization of graduate admissions and also to improve the on-campus experience of potential graduate students. So we've got 10 minutes or however long anyone would like to stay to answer questions. So Mallory?
Yeah, here I am coming back. Hold on. Just need to share my webcam. Perfect. So we have lots of awesome questions. And the first one I'm going to read out is from Dee. She's wondering if it's possible to get an estimated time that it should take to create an experience map.
Oh, yeah, sure. So in terms of the research itself, the research is going to be I think the longest time span. So I would say that if you were starting from nothing at all, that I would want to conduct somewhere in the 20 to 25 one-on-one interviews with members of your audiences, because that will give you a fairly good basis of data. So I would say that for each of those interviews, you might spend 45 minutes on the phone talking with them, and probably another 45 minutes to an hour revisiting that conversation and taking apart and chunking the information that you get there. So let's say that you're going to spend, maybe about 40 hours, 40 to 50 hours doing the actual research. As you create the experience map yourself, I think you've got a couple of choices. You can either create the experience map as a group exercise, and in that sort of process, I would identify subject matter experts or people from across those different silos to come together with a bunch of Post-its and a big wall to start creating the different phases, the stages, and together making decisions about what that experience is for your target audience. I would say that that would be maybe a 4-hour plus a break and then another 3 hours to come back to it. So I would budget a day for doing this as a group exercise. If you were doing this yourself, it would probably take less time. I would say somewhere between 4 to 6 hours to draw this out. But then there would be time for going back and actually having people give you feedback and then refining the map. So that is that's a brief estimate. So I think that is a fairly realistic time frame for creating both the artifact and then doing the research. I should confess that the research that we did for University of Buffalo actually took probably more like 200 hours, but there was a great amount of data that we actually didn't decide to use for the experience map. So if you're one of those people who really, really likes to do a bunch of research, go to it.
Well, you actually, in that response, answered a couple other questions. Someone was wondering how many users do you typically talk to as part of the research, and you touched on that. But could you go a little further? Lisa's wondering, what are some of the best ways to gather data to create experience maps? So what I heard you say was those, actually talk to people. That's one way. But are there others?
Yeah, I honestly, I am a big proponent of those one-on-one conversations as a basis. And the reason is that what you are doing with the experience map really is trying to capture the individual tales and to tell a story. And so the best conversations, the ones that that give you nuances into the experiences and the feelings and the thoughts are the ones that make the experience map come alive. And that's really what you want to do, is capture the things that you wouldn't necessarily think of if you were thinking about your product or service first. I mean, when you're thinking about the mindset of the target audience that you're trying to reach, you're trying to ferret out, well, what are they going through? What's on their mind? What is driving them? I think that's harder, much harder to get at with qualitative surveys and quantitative surveys, because you don't get to drill into those questions the way you would if you were having a conversation. If, however, what you have are those qualitative and quantitative surveys to start, then I think that you can build at least a preliminary map from that, and then you can use that map as a way, or you can use follow-up conversations as a way for you to validate and to provide a little bit more context and meaning into what you're illustrating. Does that help?
It does. Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I would be remiss to not mention that as you exit today's webinar, there will be a very brief survey once you log out. And the feedback that you guys provide us as attendees is extremely valuable. It helps us determine future webinar topics, and it gives Voltaire a sense of how we did today. This was actually his very first webinar ever. So it's extremely important if you wouldn't mind taking 2 minutes to fill that out. We would so appreciate it. All right, let's keep moving on with some other questions. I have a bunch here. Where do I want to begin? So Nicole identified that of the examples you showed, there were very different presentations of the different maps. Do you have a favorite? Does one work better than another?
No, actually, I think that if you're doing the experience map well, I'm not sure that you'll ever end up with experience maps that look exactly like each other. Because really the goal of the experience map is to capture the story and to convey a large amount of data. So I would say that when you're sitting down and creating the experience map, you can start with the general framework, which is, we need to make sure that the principles are represented. We need to capture the stages of the phases of the process. We need to make sure that we've got the different touch points. And those touch points can be conversations with customer service or admissions counselors. They can be touch points on the website. Then we want to capture thinking, feeling, and doing. And then we want to capture opportunities. Those are the building blocks of an experience map. How you illustrate that really depends on the story that you're trying to tell. And so I would say that, in some cases, using the differentiated icons that Adaptive Path did were really helpful because they gave a sense of what people were using most. In the example of the graduate schools that we did, we decided not to do that with the icons because if you know about graduate admissions is a fairly fractured process. So the goal for us in that experience map was to try and identify a common narrative that skated across graduate programs in the sciences, graduate programs in engineering, terminal programs that resulted in a master's, academic programs that launched you into your PhD. And so for us, differentiating on those touch points was not as important as capturing the things that we knew were true across all the programs and were valid across all the experiences. So this is in many ways an exercise in data visualization, and you can draw inspiration for your experience map for many of the models that we've shown. If you are really wanting to dig into the visualization side of things, I would take a look at Tufte, Tufte, who is the godfather of infographics and data visualization and can show you some beautiful illustrations. He actually goes around the country and gives one-day workshops on data visualization, and I think he would be a great source for inspiration in illustrating what experience maps can look like. And honestly, if you plug experience maps into Google, you will get more pictures of experience maps than you'll know what to do with. In fact, there are probably about a dozen Pinterest boards right now that have pictures of lovely, lovely maps.
Awesome. Well, that's great, and I tweeted out that name, Tufte, in case anybody missed that. The next question, and I love this one. This one's from our friend Mike over at Exeter. He is wondering how user personas fit into experience mapping. So do you create maps for each persona? Do you lay out a master map and then walk each persona through it? You know, what do you do?
So the question is, it depends on what exactly you're working on. So for instance, with the broadband customer, they started with a persona. And I know that with Railway Europe, they started with persona work that they had done maybe a year before they started experience mapping. So in those two cases, the personas pre-existed, and what they did was they used the persona to drive the individual experience map. What we did with graduate admissions was a little different because we were trying to find a sort of common process. And part of the reason for that was the institution we're working with is going from a very fragmented process in which every department does its own admissions to a process by which admissions is centralized. So we started from the standpoint of a common process, and then from that common process, we created the personas that drove the nuances and the differences among the psychographic audience sorts that they had. So with the graduate admissions project, it was someone traveling from overseas versus someone who wanted a PhD and wanted to teach versus someone who was getting a credential. So I think that either process is valid. I think in some cases, personas can inform the experience map, and you would create a very specific experience map for each persona. In other cases, if what you're trying to do is to even out or streamline a process, I think that the experience map comes first, and then you create the personas, and then the content plans around those personas to help really transition those personas to that common process. Don't you love it when consultants say it depends?
Love it, always. Okay, so kind of along that same line, I've got a few questions around applying an experience map. So like, for example, you showed us the graduate school.
Yeah.
Now, what if for a large website, do you do a separate experience map for each unit? What if, someone on our webinar happens to just work for one of the schools within the university? Should they have their own experience map? Should the university at large have the experience map? What's the right balance there?
Yeah, and this is going to sound so impolitic. I have yet to work with an institution where everything is so coordinated that people from the top level are talking down to the department level. So if that actually happens, if that is you, you're a statistical unicorn, and I really want to meet you and talk, because that would be awesome. But I would say that creating an experience map at the level that you are working with is really what makes the most sense. So I can tell you with some of our clients, we have created experience maps for people at the top level. So when they come to the blank.edu, and then separate experience maps for when they get to the school level. But when you think about it, at the top level, for instance, we might be targeting the graduate student applicant, but at the department level, we're targeting a graduate student who is looking for a PhD. So I think that there are ways to either adapt the experience maps to the different levels, or really to customize both the experience maps and the personas to what you know your individual unit needs. Because there are lots of times that individual units have audiences or serve audiences that the top level website doesn't really. So I would say that if you have a question about process, or you want to improve the process for the people you're serving, that it's perfectly valid for you to engage in the process of mapping this out and seeing where it is that you can improve that process for them.
Walter, have you heard of service blueprints before? And if so, are they different than an experience map?
I have heard of service blueprints before, and in fact, I don't work with them all that much. I will tell you that there is a great experience map webinar done by Adaptive Path on Gerald School's site that talks about the subtle nuances between service maps, which are basically about the sort of level of services that people provide to the different audiences, and this, which is a little bit more about the experience that we know that they're having internally and what they're thinking and doing and feeling. I think that they play very well together, and I think that you can use the experience maps and those service blueprints as cross-references to see where it is that, so if you were looking at an experience map and you identified 4 opportunities for improvement, that could actually cascade very well into the service blueprint that outlines what it is that you provide for audiences, because then that becomes a sort of roadmap for what we would want to change or do or add or stop doing in terms of services to meet the needs. But I will confess that I don't work with service blueprints as much as other people have, so I would check out that Adaptive Path webinar.
Cool, thanks. So how do you find a balance between being too generic and too individualized? And specifically, there are multiple identified segments or personas moving through a process. That was a question from Zach.
Yeah, that is such a great question. And honestly, it is a bit of a high wire act, because what experience maps do is they're meant to tell the general story. And as a result of that, you end up losing some of the nuanced detail. And that's why I like doing the personas after doing the experience map, because once you have that sort of journey mapped out, then you can start drilling into the individual psychographics that really influence the decisions that people make. So the way I like to balance this out is to make the experience map a little bit more general and to have the personas be more specific. But I do think that there's a sort of gut instinct that you have at a certain point when you look at an experience map and you say, meh, that doesn't really tell me anything, or that doesn't advance my understanding, or the difference between what we just mapped out doesn't look much different from buying a cup of coffee at Starbucks, in which case the experience map has no use. It has no ability to drive change or to identify areas for improvement. So I think that, two-part answer, I would use personas to balance them out and provide detail, but then I would also do a gut check and to get feedback from other stakeholders, because the experience maps, when they capture information that's helpful, they tend to inspire people to think about new ideas and change. And if someone looks at the experience map and says, yeah, okay, that's nice, but doesn't start to think about, this really helps us to understand what we might want to do better, what we might want to do different, then I think that's an indication that a level of specificity is necessary, or more detail on the story is necessary to have that experience map have teeth. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Voltaire. And we're actually at our last question. And I saved this one specifically for the end. I thought this was great. It's from Christine. And she's wondering, how do you transition the map from what may be currently happening to what you want to happen?
Such a great question. So
right?
What? Yeah, totally. So yeah, in that particular case, there are two things that you can do. Yeah, the first is that you can create one level of the experience map, and this is where the experience map ends up flexing to your need, right? You can create one set of thinking, feeling, doing, and opportunities, and then at the bottom of that, you can actually create the experience that you want them to have. So once you know what the experience is currently like, you can start to map out with your fellow stakeholders what the experience should be. And then you can use that either as a before and after on the same page, or in some cases, if there's a lot of detail, what you'll want to do is create an experience map of the current situation, and then the experience map of the ideal situation. And those things should have a bit of a shelf life because you can use them at a 6-month checkpoint or 9-month checkpoint, at a year-long checkpoint, and say, okay, how close are we to the model that we mapped out of the current client experience? And where is it that we've made improvements to get to what we want in terms of the ideal experience we want them to have? So in that case, you can actually create a before or after, or you can create iterative maps if you need to tier the process of improvement. And if you do that, I would love to hear more about that. And if I can be of any help at all, find me on Twitter or email me.
Cool. And I just tweeted out a link so folks know we are doing another session on experience mapping on September 25th. And this one is a $99 webinar. Voltaire is going to be leading that session. More details are coming soon. I did tweet out the link. We'll be updating that site. But we wanted to use today's session and see what questions people had, and we're building off of what we learned today. So it's going to be a really great session. I'll make sure that I email that link out to everyone, but I did put it in GoToWebinar, and I also just tweeted it out. So we'd love to see you there. Please sign up.
Mallory?
So much. Yes, go right ahead.
One last thing, just to break in. Check it out. I was talking with Indy Young, Adaptive Path co-founder and mental models author, a couple of days ago. She's in Chicago for a day-long webinar, or not webinar, but workshop on empathy in business. So if you are in the Chicago area Tuesday the 16th, register for this event. I mean, she's absolutely fabulous, and it would be money and time well spent. Okay,
that's awesome. Voltaire, let's make sure that we put a link to that in the email we send out within the next day or so. That's got the slide deck and the webinar recording, because that's so cool. I didn't even know. That's great. I love it. Cool. Well, thanks, everybody. Voltaire, thank you so much for your time and preparing this session today. It was awesome. I can't wait for you to check out the back channel. You're going to love it. Everyone, like I said, yeah, in 48 hours or so, you'll get an email from us. It'll have the archive, the slide deck, and a link to this awesome session in Chicago. And please don't forget, when you exit today, we have that very short survey, and we so appreciate your time filling that out. It'll take you 3 minutes tops, I promise. Everyone, we appreciate it. Thanks, and hopefully we see you on a future webinar. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.